Greetings YouTube, the author Mark Simmons here, back for the 9th instalment of my readings from the Psionic Powers Trilogy. In this episode I'll be reading a snippet from my second book in the trilogy, which is called Purged in Flame. In this episode I'll be reading from the opening the book. In the story so far, the protagonist, his creator, and one other member of the group have survived an attack on the assembly hall, and they're now making their way back home. Purged in Flame is available on Amazon via Poe Boy Publishing. As always, I've not rehearsed this, so we'll see how it goes. And this is an extract from chapter 1 of book 2, and it is called Out of the Fire. Consciousness was an overrated concept, or at least that's how Whitfield Creed saw it. He would have been happier with oblivion at this moment in time. The quiet emptiness that came with it. Yet it was eternity that now weighed down upon him. He had the idea of eternal life thrust upon him, but the realist in him couldn't help but be sceptical. Immortality was nothing more than a myth, right? A shopping trolley full of stolen goods took up the centre of the road, so Whitfield applied the brakes and swerved the van around the obstacle. It wasn't the first object he had to navigate, and he was sure that it wouldn't be the last. The creatures he now shared an existence with and formed the concept he felt for his eternal predicament. These self-proclaimed immortals held themselves in high regard and cared very little for the average member of the public, so much so that they have used the fragile economic state of the city that Whitfield now drove through to cause the local population to riot, using their anger-fueled looting as a smokescreen for their own deeds. Two of them sat in the front seat next to him, but they had both earned his trust to an extent. They'd proven that they were not all bad, both helping him when he needed saving, and yet both had shown they were capable of inflicting extreme acts of violence on others. Were they both trustworthy, or was it just a matter of time before they turned their malice his way? Even in their seated positions, Whitfield could feel Kadir towering over him. Her broad shoulders limited his manoeuvrability in the small front cabin of the van. Whitfield had become accustomed to her looming over him, be it physically or making sure that he was doing things correctly. He glanced in her direction. "Keep your eyes on the road," she barked at him in Portuguese. The use of his native tongue sounded strange after being surrounded by Anglophones. English was the language they used in this city that he had been calling home for a few years now, so that was how he replied to her. "You're the boss." He returned his eyes to what lay ahead, but he could see in his peripheral vision that she was busy studying the burnt skin on her left forearm. A firebomb had caused the injury, and she was lucky that it was just her arm that had caught alight. Others had not been so fortunate. If she was suffering, there was no sign of it across her stern features. She had a section of skin missing from the left side of her scalp, her left eye was swollen, and she had an entry wound in her left shoulder blade. But they may as well have not existed. Next to Kadir in the window seat, Shannon was also licking her wounds. A blow to her right elbow from an axe had practically taken her forearm off. She still held it in place as if the wound was going to repair itself somehow. Whitfield had seen the injury, and there was no way that limb could be rescued. Yet as he glanced sideways, he could swear that her fingers were moving. The ideas that ran through his head weren't impossible, merely improbable. He had watched Shannon slit a man's throat and drink from the open vein. If he was to believe the stories being thrown at him, blood had healing powers to these beings. They didn't like to be referred to as vampires, preferring not to label themselves. one of the few idioms of their kind he agreed with. Whether they labelled themselves or not, the truth was that these creatures had eternal life, and they drank the blood of others. He had stood and watched more than one of them partake in the red stuff, which, whether they liked it or not, made them vampires, even if they didn't call themselves such. But the drinking of blood, healing a severed limb, was a little far-fetched, even for Whitfield. He took his mind off the two women by concentrating on the road ahead. The streets were empty, but the carnage of the rioting that had spilled out onto them remained. Debris lay strewn across many of the roads, and the van felt like it was hitting every single piece. The jolts and bumps helped him to get two sets of angry eyes boring into him, but he just ignored them. There was no way around the rubble, so he ploughed on through. Yet as he turned onto the next street, the rioting may as well have not happened. The mayhem of the previous few days had managed to avoid this thoroughfare altogether. But one more street over, and they drove towards a car that was ablaze, its flaming shell partially blocking the road. Whitfield slowed down and drove up onto the curb to get past the wreck. His off-road driving got him more dirty looks and some choice words from Shannon under her breath, but he wasn't listening. The word police was written along the side of the vehicle in flames. Memories of the heavily outnumbered officers from the night before came flooding back. It appeared that this law enforcement vehicle had been just as unsuccessful as keeping the peace as they had. 2 riot shields and a riot helmet lay just to the other side of the car. They turned another corner and his foot hovered over the accelerator. 20 or so looters were pulling electrical equipment out of a smashed shop window. They all wore hoods and had pieces of material tied around their faces. Whitfield felt a chill run down his spine at the sight of them, waiting for them to see the van and come running towards it. But as the vehicle crept closer and a few of the looters looked their way, he realised that these people weren't the creatures that he and his companions had been fighting all evening. They were just a group of people out to rob an electrical goods shop. Regardless of everyone's motives, chaos had been the law on the street that night. From the steering column, an alarm started beeping, followed by a red flashing light that told him one of the doors was open. Unfortunately, the screen on the dashboard didn't tell him whether it was the double doors at the back, the sliding side door, or either the doors in the front cabin. Something moved in Whitfield's passenger wing mirror, and before he could react or even comment on it, the window shattered inwards. Shannon took the brunt of the glass shower and instinctively ducked away from the shards onto Kadir's shoulder. An arm reached through the broken window and grabbed a hold of Shannon's shirt. Her strength still not with her, Shannon was pulled towards the opening. Kadir quickly wrapped her own muscular arm around Shannon's slight physique and dragged her back into the cabin. Kadir's efforts helped to pull their attacker into sight, and an image that Whitfield had become accustomed to came into view. The young assailant's mouth, like so many of their attackers over the previous few nights, had been forced closed, and like each horror show Whitfield had witnessed, this one was just as unique. A number of metal climbing clips had been forced up through the skin under his chin and then looped down over the bottom teeth, shattering most of the front row of the gums. He pulled on Shannon's clothing again, and the tug of war swung back in his favour. Whitfield felt helpless as he watched the tussle happen to his left. He looked forward and swerved to avoid a central reservation, clipping it with a back wheel. The vehicle swung back and forth before Whitfield managed to regain control. The short loss of steering gave him an idea, and he looked ahead to see if there was anything that could help him. As what he was looking for came speeding towards him, something bashed against the metal wall behind him, knocking him forward in his chair. He turned to look behind him and saw a lump in the centre of the chair's back cushion. It appeared and was swiftly followed by another thump. The point of a pickaxe pierced through the wall just to the left of his chair. It twisted in a hole twisted in the hole it had created, and then was yanked back through, making the whole back wall come away from its fixing slightly. Whitfield turned back to the road, but kept his body leant over the steering wheel. Next to him, his two companions still fought with their attacker. He saw another opportunity to help them come flying towards him, so he put his foot down and swerved to get nearer. The pickaxe struck against the hole. Pickaxe struck again, and the whole wall shook as the van steered close to a lamppost. There was a muffled grunt as the young man holding onto Shannon struck the street light and then disappeared. The whole top half of the wall came away in an ear-splitting screech as metal ground against metal. Whitfield turned so that he was side on to the rest of the cabin and waited for the pickaxe to strike again. Instead, a pair of hands reached over the gap and pulled the wall away further. A face formed out of the darkness of the back compartment, a wolfish grin shining at them from behind the plastic screen of a police riot helmet. He saw Whitfield first and reached for him. With the calmness that Whitfield had become accustomed to, Gadir casually pulled her knife from its sheath and forced the blade up under the plastic screen into the man's jaw. He stared at Whitfield for the briefest of seconds, a look of confusion on his features, before he fell back into the recesses of the van's storage space. Gadir wiped the blood from her knife onto the seat with the same casual manner she had just killed a man, and then pointed to the road ahead. "Keep your eyes on the road," she ordered again, and there was less bite in her words this time. Whitfield did as he was told and continued to drive at a sensible speed. Light flashed in the wing mirror and took Whitfield's eyes off the road again. A car was coming up behind them. It was moving fast and looked to have no regard for the speed limit. Whitfield moved closer to the curb so that it could pass. When a second identical car came up alongside it, worry churned in Whitfield's stomach. He pulled back into the centre of the road and put his foot down, but he knew straight away that he couldn't outrun them. "We might have company," Whitfield said as he threw a glance at the other wing mirror. Gadir leant forward so that she could look in the mirror, and she grimaced at what she saw. Shannon had a look in the other mirror, and her response was just as grim. "Can we outrun them?" Gadir said finally. "Not in this thing," Whitfield replied. Both cars had closed the gap between them quickly, but neither came too close, holding their positions a few feet back. A car pulled out ahead of them, its brake lights flooding the cabin with a red hue as it slowed down. Whitfield turned the wheel so that he could go around it, but his foot slammed onto the brakes as it turned side onto them. As they careened towards it, Whitfield had a split second to decide what to do. Should he come to a stop and see whom these people were, or should he ram the van right through them? He dropped it down a gear and made ready to hit the car at speed when the passenger door opened and someone stepped out onto the road. He had no intention of running someone over to get where he was going, so he slowed down and came to a stop a short way from the car ahead. The two cars kept their distance as they stopped behind them. "I'll hold off as many as I can, but my strength is not with me," Gadir said as she made ready to slide along the bench seat. Shannon looked just as unsure as she opened the door. "It's all on you, newborn," she said as she slid out of the cabin. There you go. Opening chapter, or opening scene of Purged in Flame. Purged in Flame is available via Poe Boy Publishing on Amazon. Links will be in the description, along with my Facebook author page, my Instagram page, my Twitter page. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.